So as I mentioned, Rabbi Harris really would have loved to have been here, but at the last minute couldn't be here because of COVID. So I want to offer a teaching this morning from one of my teachers, who's now the dean of the Jewish Theological Seminary's Rabbinical School. And it's on a topic which I just want to mention, kind of a subject matter warning on a topic that can be hard to talk about, but that is exactly in this week's Torah portion. It's the part that we read this year about the rape of Dinah. So I wanted to just mention that in case anybody isn't comfortable hearing about that today. And her teaching, which I've edited a little bit for a length, is called Remember Dinah, Listen to Women. So this is in the words of Rabbi Ayelet Cohen with just light editing by me. Maybe some extra little comments. One of the most horrifying phenomena in the aftermath of October 7th is the attempt to erase and deny the brutal sexual violence that Hamas perpetrated that day against Israeli women and girls. This has even been true of international women's rights groups, whose mission is to document sexual violence as a weapon of war. To ignore the violence perpetrated against Israeli women is to erase their experience. Dinah's story in the Torah is often overlooked in a parsha rich with other narratives that are easier and more pleasant to explore. But this is not a time to shy away from difficult stories or to avoid stories of sexual violence. Shabbat Vayishlach can be an opportunity for our communities to center the stories of women and girls in their fullness and explore the ways our communities can become communities of support. Dinah is a singular character in Genesis, the only named daughter born to Jacob. Her existence, even, is something of a paradox. Her whole story is contained in 2 verses. Far more attention is given to the story of her brothers avenging her rape than the story of the rape itself. We know nothing of Dinah's story before or after. Dinah herself never speaks. From Genesis chapter 34, this is one of the verses we read today. Vatetzeh Dinah bat Leah, asher yalda leYaakov, lirot bivnot haaretz. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, who she bore to Jacob, went out to visit the daughters of the land. Why is Dinah named this way? To remind you, I'll go back to the verse. The daughter of Leah, who she bore to Jacob, went out to visit the daughters of the land. That's the verse we have about her. Rashi, citing several midrashim in Breshit Rabbah, comments that this is to emphasize that she has inherited an undesirable characteristic of Leah's, of her mother's. Like her, Dinah is called a yatzanit, one who likes to go out. The root of that word, yatsa, going out. A going outer, I might, in my own words, say. Since Leah went out to meet Jacob to seduce him with the mandrakes. This is in contrast to the women in Jacob's family of origin, Sarah and Rebekah, who traditionally stayed in their tents. Ramban, so that was Rashi. Ramban, a different medieval commentator, explains the reference to Jacob is to draw the connection to Dinah's brothers, Simeon and Levi, who will avenge her. In these explanations, Dinah is blamed for her rape, as women often are. The focus is then diverted to her brother's vengeance, their interpretation of what happened to her, and their decision on how to react. And we never hear from Dinah again. Tamar Kadari, a modern Israeli midrash professor, actually I got the chance, Rabbi Megdal, I got the chance to learn with when I was studying in Jerusalem, who's brilliant. So Rabbi Cohen's quoting her in her introduction to a collection called Dirshuni, Contemporary Women's Midrash. Kadari elucidates the limitations of midrashim, of interpretations written by men. In a time, especially in a time when women's lives and women's agency were understood through a very narrow lens. She writes that these perspectives express, quote, mistaken understandings of God's will and intentions. And this is not what God truly wants. In these cases, we may need to depart from classical rabbinic literature and create new interpretations. So how do we discern God in Dinah's story? We can start by not blaming her. And then now Rabbi Cohen will bring two more modern female midrashists or interpreters of the Torah, interpreters of the Bible. So we had Tamar Kadari. Now Noya Sagiv is the second one. As Noya Sagiv notes in her commentary, Dabri Torah, Israeli Women Interpret the Torah, Abravanel is one of the only classical voices who comes to Dinah's defense, claiming that the comparison to Leah is actually meant as praise. So earlier we heard the interpretation that it was meant as a negative, that just like Leah went out, was a woman who goes out, so too was Dinah. But Noya Sagiv is saying it's a positive. And in her midrash, Dirshuni, a different modern Israeli female commentator, Rivka Lubitch, offers a few alternative readings. If it is Dinah's going out, which likens her to Leah, Lubitch suggests it is referring to going out for an act of mitzvah. In her case, seeking procreation with Jacob. Going out also makes her like her father, who went out on account of his brother Esau, or Esav. I always go back and forth between those two pronunciations. Likewise, she went out on account of her brothers to find a place for herself. Dinah, Lubitch writes, knew her place wasn't with her brothers. Dinah was isolated, the only sister among brothers, and went out seeking friendship with the women of the land. Lubitch expands more on Dinah's silence. Dinah was a quiet person and had no voice. Why? Because the members of her household did not listen to her and didn't engage her in conversation. According to the sage's teaching, do not engage in excessive conversation with a woman. And that is why she went out to see the daughters of the land. Dinah was like a mute, as it says, he bedded her and abused her and does not say, and Dinah cried out. But is it conceivable that she did not? And then the answer is, it's as if she were a mute. Out of the pain and the shame, she hushed up and fell silent. And now this is back to Rabbi Cohen. Perhaps this is one more way that Dinah took after her father. How is it possible that Dinah's father, Jacob, was silent after she was raped? Many of the women and girls who were subjected to terrible sexual violence on October 7th have no voices. They were murdered or kidnapped or are suffering unimaginable trauma. Those in the international community who would deny the sexual violence inflicted with such brutality on that day are willfully averting their eyes to further their own agenda at the expense of Israeli women. All too often, women are blamed, silenced, and forgotten. Earlier in the Parsha, after their dramatic reunion, Jacob says to Esav that seeing his face is like seeing the face of God. Blaming Dinah for her rape or obscuring her story also conceals the face of God. As painful and uncomfortable as the story of Dinah is, we must not ignore it or shy away from it. We must grapple with that text and what it teaches us about the rabbinic understanding, or perhaps more accurate, the rabbinic misunderstanding of women's experience, and learn how we must repair what is damaged and missing. We must recognize that we see more of the story and indeed more of the face of God when we see every member of our community. So in the name of Dinah, as Israeli women give testimony, we must listen, we must recount their stories, and we must amplify their voices. Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.